All right. We're here today with Pat Farenga, whom we first noticed on the scene, or Cecilia did earlier than I, but we read about the whole unschooling movement and John Holt and the growing without schooling. And then you, Patrick, did an interview with us some 5 years ago, I believe. And since then, we have become friends and have yet to see each other in real life.
I know, isn't that interesting? It's all been through the internet.
Yeah.
Yet I feel like I've traveled with you a little bit.
Yeah, we've talked a lot over the years, but
Yeah.
I actually don't even know if you have legs, you know.
my secret is out. I don't.
I think we do, because when you got that new webcam, remember you had it was a lot of work to get it to work, and you were really annoyed with it, and you had to walk to the other side of the room to.
So you did see I had legs.
We saw the legs.
Oh yeah.
Making up.
Yes. But Pat, we know a lot about you, but people listening in to our podcast maybe haven't heard about you, or it ring a bell. So if you can, give your story of how you came into the whole growing without schooling and got interested in world schooling, or not world schooling, unschooling and all that. I know it will be a long talk, but
that will be the hour.
That will be the hour.
Well, I'll try to keep it brief so we can have more questions. I got started in 1981 with John Holt in Growing Without Schooling. John had started the magazine in 1977. It had been published then for 4 years, and it grew out of his frustration trying to change school. His first couple of books were bestsellers, How Children Fail and How Children Learn. And it got to the point that he taught a graduate course at Harvard in education. I think it was in 68. This was in the late 60s when his first book came out in 64, the next one I think in 67. And so he even got invited to speak to Congress because back then, there were all these, not revolts, what's the word, protests against the Vietnam War and all sorts of stuff that were going on. Student rebellions were happening. And John was one of the first people of note to take the student side in a lot of these issues. That was one of the things that confounded. It's funny. A friend of mine actually got a hold of the transcripts of John's talk with Congress. Someday I hope they get it. But basically, what he said is they didn't understand a word he kept saying, because John kept referring to, individual children and how children learn individually. And they just wanted to know how we could pull a lever and make everything work throughout the whole system.
How do we write a law that works for everybody?
Exactly. Completely missing the point of individualizing education and the need for it. It was, they don't see the need for it because they're running big institutions, big schools, and they've only gotten bigger since then. We've lost neighborhood schools and like crazy here in America. In fact, a lot of the buildings have been turned into stores or movie theaters and stuff, and abandoned. We have these huge magnet schools now, they call them.
Pat, but how did you end up working together?
Well, here's how I wound up working. I was a graduate student in English. I got my master's in English literature, and I thought I'm originally from New York. So when I finished graduate school, I went there to work. And with my wonderful new master's degree in English, I became a store clerk in a department store. And I did that for about 6 months. And the whole time I was traveling to Boston to be with my girlfriend, who became my wife, Day. And, I finally said, I could work in a department store in Boston just as easily and save a lot of travel. So that's how I wound up coming back here, to be near my girlfriend. And I wound up working in a bookstore. But fortunately for me, that bookstore was near where John Holt, his office was. He had an office on the suite on the 3rd floor of this building, but on the ground floor next door to it was a bookstore called the Paperback Booksmith. And the one in downtown Boston was very big and popular. And John was a frequent customer there. And so I was working at another branch that he had opened just literally like the next street up. It's called Booksmith, another edition. And that was where they sold what they call remainder books, hardcover books that, were at an incredibly discounted price. But John's, it turned out that one of the cashiers who worked at the remainder store, where I became assistant manager, just because I had this degree that made me assistant manager. Even though I had never worked in a bookstore before, I certainly patronized them. So, there I am in the bookstore, and the cashier there, her husband, was working as a volunteer at Holt Associates with helping to publish Growing Without Schooling magazine and help John do his work. And I mean, like anyone back in 1981, you heard the word homeschooling, you're like, what's that? I don't know. So I didn't immediately warm up to this idea, but after working in the bookstore for a while, and especially when the owner did this, we had so many people coming in because it was a recession. This is the 1980s, 1981. So many people my age would be coming in off the street looking for work as cashiers and stuff. And they saw that we're a new store and open. So the owner put up a sign that said, you need a college degree to apply, something like that. And I'm thinking to myself, to do this, to do what? I've got a master's degree. And they're telling me I need to do this. This is, that really started to bother me. But then I realized now in hindsight, that was a way to prevent certain people from applying. I mean, back then I was just thinking, college, we don't need it. But now I realize, no, he's actually using the college degree as a way to prevent non-college people from working a cash register, and stocking shelves, and talking about books. I mean, the assumption was if you're a college graduate, you're going to read all these books. But outside of a few of my colleagues at that store, most of them didn't read a lot of books, and most of them couldn't care less. It was just a job, and they couldn't wait to go do what they wanted to do after work. They wouldn't talk about the latest novels or, what was happening. So, it was sort of a wake up call. And I decided, I don't want to do this. I can't, this book business is not what I like, but I still like books. So Cindy was her name, the cashier. And she said, well, if you want to volunteer at Holt Associates, you could pack books there. They have a mail order book business. And you also do a lot of typing, and you can learn word processing, which back then was a skill unto itself. It was a whole machine by itself. It's not like today, where you have word processors built into your phone. So John Holt had an Olivetti word processor, and Boston at the time was completely inundated with Wang word processors. In fact, the Wang company was, it used to be called the Wang Opera House. They donated. That's, how the mighty have fallen, right? No one remembers Anne Wang and word processors and stuff. But yeah, the late 70s to the late 80s, that was a real big deal. So I went there to learn these skills, and John was not there. John was doing a tour of Scandinavia. He had been invited by the University of Göteborg, I think you pronounce it, in Sweden, to speak. And then friends of his, Rasmus Hansen, I think was his name, from Denmark. John spoke around Sweden, Norway, and Denmark over a 3-month period. And so he was, that was because Teacher On had just come out, and it was just considered so crazy, that, he was getting a lot of speaking engagements, to talk about it. And so when John finally came back, because I was still working, I wasn't getting paid to work at Holt Associates at that time. So I was working in the evenings, volunteering, and because I was still working at the bookstore during the day. And one night there was John Holt. He had come back from Scandinavia, and as was, he was a single man, and he often liked to read books in the office, and he would read like, I don't know, 3 or 4 books a day sometimes. It was amazing how quickly and thoroughly he could get through stuff. And so when he saw me there, he introduced himself, we talked, and we immediately hit it off because I learned that he was born and raised in Manhattan, in New York, and he loved jazz. And so the two of us just, because I'm from the Bronx and I like jazz. And in fact, that was something I was actually studying at the time. I was taking lessons in jazz piano. So I was really, really into this. And we really hit it off. And finally, one night, one time, it may have even been the first time. I think it was actually. John asked me, "Well, what do you want to do with your life, Pat?" And right out of the blue, I said, "I want to be a teacher." And he looked at me and said, "Why?" I said, "Because I like working with children." And I could see him doing this right now. He took his glasses off, leaned into me and said, "Pat, you realize if you become a teacher, you're not going to work with children. You're going to work on children." And I was just like, "What?" That's what teaching's like. That's not what it's about. And have you ever read any of my books? I said, "No, it's true. I was just up there to learn word processing, you know?" And so he recommended that I read any one of them and then he'd be happy to talk, but he's not going to, he just spent 3 months talking about this stuff in Europe. He's not going to start from scratch with me. He said, "If you're interested, read a book and we'll talk about it." And then he recommended Ivan Illich's Deschooling Society to me. He said, that's also, that would be something else. But he says, unless you have this foundation, I'm not going to, spend my time right now.
I'm going to spend time with you.
Yeah, all right. I'm happy to talk about jazz and other things, but because it's still true. Here it is in 2023, and I still hear, "Well, what about socialization? How are right?" It's just like, oh my gosh, we have so many, 3 generations. And before I was coming on the call, I was trying to set up a Facebook Live event for this coming Sunday about unschooling neurodiverse children. And so I remembered that, I had an issue. There was a couple of issues, but there was one that was a cover story about unschooling children with special needs. And that was from 1996. And, to think that, here we are today, still saying to ourselves, will unschooled children be, will they get into college? Is it appropriate for special needs children? It's like, I've been there, done that. And now I'm 65 now, and I'm like, John, I kind of feel like John, no, I don't want to talk about, about those things. I mean, you can readily find that information out, right? Especially now that we have the internet. Back then it was you'd have to go to a library and find out something, now it's so much easier. So, I thought he was kind of crazy, but at the same time, I took him up on his challenge. So the book Teach Your Own, it just arrived. Literally, that was one of my first jobs, was to open the cartons and put the hardcover editions. It hadn't come out in paperback yet, and put them up on the shelf, right? And so I took that book with me, and I couldn't understand it. Teach Your Own made no sense to me in 1981. So I wound up talking to Peggy Durkee, who was John's office manager and who worked with him for many years. And she said, "Well, John's books just keep growing one out of the other. So, why don't you read How Children Fail? That's the one that I really, made me understand where he's coming from." So I did, and then I got it. Because that book I could relate to. It's about being a teacher in a classroom. Something that I wanted to do, and something that as a student I had some very recent experience of. So I could really identify with him talking about the charade of learning, how the kids pretend to know the answers, and the teacher's grateful that he thinks they know, so they can move on. Because he's losing half the class, as this half is not getting this. And so he really talked about these strategies and the issues of schooling. And it really hit home. And so when I started to talk to him about classroom techniques, and one of the things that interested me was he was into Cuisenaire rods, and he really, in How Children Fail, really, and How Children Learn even, I think more, goes on about using these manipulatives, right? And as soon as I raised it, he was like, "I'm over that." It was more gimmicky than useful. And, kids will learn their colors and how to count without these things. I mean, they're nice to have, but I don't think that if I were running a classroom, that would be the first piece of equipment I would get. And so it turns out that he was always challenging his thoughts and his writing. And indeed, in 1983, he revised How Children Fail and How Children Learn in light of his experience with unschooling. And, and when you read those books, what I love about him is he didn't excise any of the old text out. what he did was he put a line down the left side of the old text, and then the new text would be indented a bit. And he said, yeah, I thought I was a real clever teacher then when I did this, but, and so it's really refreshing to see that, because, especially in academics, this book builds on this book builds on that. And everyone like develops this oeuvre of or a canon of work that can't be challenged, or, it's just so impeccable. You're the expert that, knows everything. And John was much more humble. I realized that, like everything, like even though he wrote it in 1964 with like complete conviction, things changed. He grew, people changed, the world changed. I mean, just look what's happening now with artificial intelligence and how that's changing. I mean, there was an article in the New York Times saying that the high school reports are doomed. And no one will know if it's a student or a computer writing it now. I mean, so, there have been all these changes, but but school hasn't adapted, I mean, we still, in the United States, it is different in Scandinavia and Denmark in particular.
But Pat, to go into your personal story again, because that part I haven't actually heard, I'm curious.
Sure.
So being a volunteer to ending up now, if I could count many years later, having it turned into a profession and a career. So at some point you must have gotten paid for instead of volunteering. Right. So how did it develop, and what keep you to you keep on?
Well, so what happened was that Tim, the gentleman that was volunteering at Holt Associates, decided to leave. He actually became, if you could believe this, a typewriter salesman, because it was right at that juncture where typewriters were still being sold and computers were just coming in, So he left to do that. And so I took his part-time job. And so I was able to still work in the bookstore during the day, but now get paid to pack books and type up John's letters in the evening, and I did that for a while. And then Peggy Durkee, his office manager, the recession was finally starting to end, around 1981. And I think it was 82. Yeah, I don't think it was more than a year that I've been there. And she got a better job offer, work for an accounting company. And so, John, she and John asked if I'd be interested in becoming office manager. And actually, I take that back. Before I did that, there was one other step. Growing Without Schooling was always a marginal publication financially. It was always funded by either the sales of our books through the catalog or from John's speaking engagements and personal income. So, it was always kind of dicey. And so we decided one of the ways to raise money was to take ads in Growing Without Schooling. So they made me ad manager. And I was able to bring some ads in and stuff like that. So I think that was another reason why they felt I was qualified to be office manager, because, I was doing that outreach, and having some success. Although back then, even then, when I look at the ads, they're like business card size and they're all text and stuff, but that's the way it was.
That's the way it was back then.
Yeah. So I wound up becoming the office manager, and John and we shared the office. I mean, we had separate offices, but he liked to sit and read, near me, and it made him accessible to me, and we talk about what he was reading or what I was doing, and so we really became close and really got to know each other. Very well. And I was still a single guy at the time, and my wife was working for the National Organization for Women, because they were trying to get equal rights for women on ballot in the States, which, by the way, we still don't have. It hasn't passed in all 50 states. Did pass in Massachusetts, though. So so she was very skeptical about homeschooling. And as were most of my friends, of course, it's just a trap to keep women pregnant and at home. And I was like, well, I don't see it that way, because I was meeting families and realized like there were 2-income families. Sometimes the dad would be the stay-at-home person because the mom had a better job and could, make things happen. So I knew that they were there, but there was still like the exceptions to the rule. It really wasn't until, let's see, we got married I forget, 84, 85, and John was at her wedding, and we were, it's so funny, everybody was noticing different things, right? About our service and memories and stuff. And what I remember afterwards, like after we came back from a honeymoon, which we took in Denmark, we went to Copenhagen, and then traveled to Oslo and flew home from there. Oh gosh, I just lost my train of thought. It was
people's different memories.
Yeah. So John, so my wife and I remember the family, the service. What John remembered was at the church, he noticed that the altar boys were wearing sneakers instead of shoes. And he was way back in the audience. I was right next to them. I didn't notice, but it's funny what different people pick up on, So yeah, so we went way back, and then it got, it's been, I think about this a lot now because I've gone through so much. A lot of people have died in my family in the last few years, and just this past week, last Sunday, our dog died. I know you lost a dog when we were talking down in Spain, and my daughter raised this guy since he was 6 weeks old, and we all loved him. He was, definitely a family member. So that was
it's really hard. It's really hard.
Yeah. But when John Holt got sick, that was the first time that I had to really face, like as an adult, helping another adult deal with death. And that was quite an experience. I was 25 or 26 at the time, so I was not very, very well versed in these things, even though I grew up in a family of funeral directors. But I only knew how to handle things in the chapel. I didn't know how to handle things on a sick bed in people's homes. So that was quite a learning thing. And it took a long time. John tried all sorts of alternative therapies, and I was always setting him up. Like he went to Mexico, tried this thing called the Hoxie treatment. Then he did, oh gosh, what was it called? It was with chlorophyll. Wheatgrass therapy. So we would get like tons of wheatgrass shipped in once a week, through FedEx, and he would juice it all up. And we did that. And then he went to Ohio to have like some laser, because it was a huge tumor on his leg. And so he thought that we could get exercise with this. And it just kept getting worse. And eventually his friend Merloyd, who was also his editor for many years, had recommended a doctor in Connecticut, and he trusted her and he trusted this doctor, so he finally had the procedure done. And I should say why he didn't trust the doctors before this, because several years earlier he had noticed this lump on his leg. The doctor said we should probably remove it. And so he goes in the hospital to have it removed, and the day of the surgery they marked the wrong leg. And John told them, no, it's this leg, because when I knew it, it was like the size of my fist. But when he had it then, he said it was just like a pimple. It was small, and so and he got in an argument with the nurse, saying you got the wrong leg, and he walked out. He just walked out. That's it, and it kind of ignored it until it got so big that he couldn't, wear pants. Had to wear shorts. It was crazy. In fact, it got so big, couldn't even wear shorts at one point. We had to, we were looking for kilts. It was, it was pretty bad by the time he did it. So he went and finally had it removed, but the doctor told him, I'm not sure we got it all. I mean, I got that lump, but you've had this for a while. And sure enough, like within weeks, it had spread throughout his body. So, so I had to take care of him and, figure all that stuff out. He was moving, eventually he had to go to the hospital. And then once they stabilized him at the hospital, we got him back to his house, his apartment in Beacon Hill. And, we did hospice there. And that was another lovely moment in my life, was when I was looking for help, because, I just got married. We didn't have kids yet, and I was like, what am I supposed to do? Leave work and just go sit with John until like midnight or stuff? So we were trying to figure all this out. So we put out a call for helpers, and some families just volunteered. In fact, a woman flew, her name was Lila Berg. She flew in from England. She was a children's book author who knew John, to help care for John. You know, so people just it was just beautiful. You know, there's people coming out of the woodwork. Local people would come to do the evening shifts, and then, you know, Lila and other people be there during the day. You know, it was quite moving, you know. And one of the things that I remember from that was John was always interested in the Suzuki method, and see, right now we're all fat, you know, it's all China, and maybe India now economically. But in the 80s, it was Japan. Japan's eating our lunch. They know what they're doing. But John was just always interested in Japanese culture through music. You know, he just loved classical musicians and the Suzuki method, which emphasizes learning by ear and not introducing sight reading until later on. He always liked that approach, because he said that's how children learn to read. You know, you develop your ear first. You know, so you know he was. I'll never forget this. He was. Oh yeah, and this was it. A cellist from the Chicago Symphony Orchestra. His name was David Chickering. He was a friend of John's, and he came in to care for John, and he would play his cello, you know, while John was just lying there in bed. And John, towards the end, would just be asleep, it seemed, for hours. And I was talking to the nurse, and so we had to wake him up. And when we did, it was, he had a temper, but it was very rare that he showed it. This was one of those times. John, wake up. What? Why did you wake me up? Why did you wake me up? I was singing in Japanese.
Okay, that must be quite
right. I mean, the way
don't wake me up for that.
Yeah, but you know, music was so important to him, you know. And I'll never forget when I got the phone call that, you know, I was at the office, and no, I was at home at the time, I think. They called me and said John had passed, so I had to go down to the apartment and then, you know, get a doctor and all that stuff in there to get a death certificate and have his body removed. But I forgot about David Chickering. So as I'm walking down to his apartment, it was a basement apartment in Beacon Hill, right near the Charles River, right where the Boston Symphony Orchestra plays its summer concerts. You know, he chose that deliberately, so he could literally just walk across the street to hear the free outdoor concerts. And as I'm approaching the building, I could hear a cello playing. And as I got closer and closer, it was just David playing, you know, playing for John. It was beautiful. It was just very touching and very, very appropriate, you know. And yeah, that you know, so and then I think that was 1985. And after John died, I found myself with the reins, and you know, it was just myself and Donna Richoux, who became the editor of the magazine, and it was really like solid. She really kept she held a lot of things together, because while I was working with John's stuff, she was publishing the magazine. She kept all the correspondence going. She had it, you know, and so that was really, you know, really important. And again, I'm realizing, you know, I mean, I've thought this many times throughout my life, but I'm realizing again, just as I recount this, so much of this is about social connection. You know, I mean, yep. John was a single man. He didn't have any children. Was unlucky in love. You know, I mean, he asked people to marry him, and she said no, you know, more than once. Yeah. So, you know, and you know, so I'm familiar with that part of his life. But at the same time, you know, there's so many people that gathered around him and loved him. You know, and so that was an important lesson for me as a young man, to realize. It was I'm used to this. I grew up in a very Italian family with a funeral home, and you know, we all wore suits and go down to the funeral home and pay our respects over 3 days. And this was just like a whole nother way of dealing with death. You know, there was no funeral. You know, it was cremated, and we had a memorial service a few months later. You know, which I understand is common, but you know, but for a non-Catholic, I mean, for a Catholic Italian growing up in the Bronx, that was yet another learning experience. Like, oh, there's other ways to do dying too. You know, you just don't go to the hospital, then they declare you dead, and then you go to the funeral home. You know? So it was another eye-opening thing for me, you know. And it really, I learned so much more than just about education by being at Growing Without Schooling. And then Donna ran the magazine for a couple of years, and then she got pregnant and wasn't sure she could continue. And so Susanna Sheffer, who John had told me, he recommended her because we knew that Donna might change her mind or leave at some point. But John had recommended her because she was working at an alternative school in Michigan called the Clonlara School, which at the time had a great home-based education program. And the founder of the school, Pat Montgomery, she's still around. She's a firebrand. She would, anytime any school official tried to question why you're homeschooling using the Clonlara curriculum, she would, on her own dime, fly down there and argue with the guys, and she spent a lot of time in court, successfully arguing that,
Clonlara is still around, isn't it?
Oh, it's still around, but I don't think they have the home-based education program anymore.
I think they do. I think I met an adult woman about in her early 30s who.
Yeah, Nicole. Not Nicole. What's her name? Chandra Montgomery. Chandra Nicole.
No. This is just someone I met who had her education that way. She was.
Oh, she's a graduate of Clonlara.
Grew up in Barcelona, and she was never in school, and she did the Clonlara. She told me, and that was how she managed to grow up in Barcelona without ever being in a Spanish school.
That's right.
And she's young-ish. I mean, it must be 10, 15 years ago since she stopped. And she said she was planning to put her children through the same program. So I think it's still around. But it still has curriculum and it's not on.
They focus more on the campus program because they built a beautiful school. I was there in fact. When they honored Pat, I flew into Michigan to help with that, because Pat's retired and her daughter Chandra is been running the school now for many years. But anyway, go ahead. Ask me another question.
Yeah, no. I have a question because first of all, thank you for the very touching story about your time together with John. But what kept you going? It was before you even had children, and you have, as you say, you took over the reins and have been on this for many, many years. What is it with homeschooling, unschooling that talks so strongly to you that you continue?
To me, it was first of all, my own personal experience of school was very, I was successful as a student. I wasn't a genius. I was a middle to the top of the middle sort of grades. But I just kept wondering, really, right up until 8th grade, is this all there is? Is it just read a book and take a test? Read a book and take a test, right? And I'll never forget in 8th grade, we're doing all these high school, what high school do you want to go to sort of programs. And since it was a Catholic school, they were directing us all these Catholic places. And I didn't want to go to Stepanak, which is where everyone was going, the Archbishop Stepanak High School, because I just felt it was more read a book and take a test. And so I wanted to look for options. And my dad said, well, look, if you want to come down, we were living in Elmsford, New York at that time, but we moved from the Bronx. But when I was in 3rd grade, we moved up to Westchester. But Dad still had to work in the Bronx. So he said, well, look, there's a great high school in the Bronx, Fordham Prep. You can drive down with me in the morning and drive home with me after work if you want to go there. So I went to an open house there, and it just blew me away because they were introducing a thing called the Fordham Prep Plan, where you got to make your own schedule for the day. You checked in with a mentor twice a day. That was basically your homeroom teacher. And they were organizing, once a month they had what they called X days, where each department would put on a special event, like the science department put on a movie about nuclear, what would happen in a nuclear war and stuff like that, And so it was so different and so cool. I was like, I'm there. And it was on the Fordham University campus. So the high school shared, you're around all these, the college facilities. It was just it was a campus. So it was a completely different feel than going to a city high school, that I would just take a regular bus to. So instead, I drove down with Dad, dropped me off, and I take the bus to meet him at work afterwards. And I was really, really like pleased with Fordham Prep and in those days, because it just opened my mind to like, oh, it doesn't have to be read a book and take a test. You could watch a movie. You could talk to people. You can have discussion groups. I was when I was first introduced to discussion groups, and it was really interesting. But being the field of education, which is ultimately terribly conservative, and by the time I was a junior, they were, so in 3 years, they were pulling back on the program. And then in my junior year, or maybe it was my senior year, but it would have been my junior year, because it was a senior that the senior student died of a drug overdose, right? So this would have been 70, 69 or 70. And immediately the parents, there was all this pressure. And of course, we're students, I don't know, but I heard from my parents and the communications they were getting, it was because of the liberal nature of the school.
Oh yeah, of course.
That's why he used drugs, and that's it, right? So by the end of my senior year, they were clamping down, and I think within 2 years, like after I got into college, no more Fordham Prep plan. They didn't use it. They just went back to being a classic Jesuit high school, following the essential curriculum. But I got a taste, and I was like, that's how I like to learn. It's a social activity. It's not like this, read a book and take a test and then see how you did compared to everybody else. I mean, that always has bothered me. It just seemed like a performative exercise, not really, because I forgot, John wrote this in How Children Fail. The only difference between a good student and a bad student is the good student is very careful not to forget what they studied until after the test.
Yeah.
And that just hit me like a ton, because that was Fordham Prep. I mean, that's what it became. It's just like, just give the answer and you're going to get a grade and everything's going to be fine. It was not like this more holistic experience of like, in fact, during the Fordham Prep plan days, on the X days, some of the departments would do travel like into the city to do stuff, So I saw that it could be, education didn't have to be like the way that we're doing it. Then I went to college. And, what can you do? College is college, No one's going to change that, although it's going to happen.
I don't know how it is. Please educate.
Well,
actually, I'm from Europe. We don't have college. We do. I think it's obvious what it is. To me, it's not. How is college?
College in America is a 4-year, contest to see if you can get a job once you graduate. And some people are so focused, like, particularly business schools or pre-med, what you're going to do for those 4 years, right? And then you're going to go to the job fairs. But if you're someone like me, a liberal arts major, an English major, I mean, I wasn't even aware there were job fairs on campus. They didn't announce these sorts of things, And so I was going to be an English teacher because that was my favorite subject, and that's it. And I worked in the funeral business as a kid, and I want to become a funeral director, I mean, those were my only choices. It seemed, I didn't have enough experience of the world. And that's another thing that I really appreciated from John and from, Growing Without Schooling, is seeing that education does not have to just be going to school. It doesn't have to have school at all. And that really appealed to me, because after I finished graduate school, which I enjoyed, but I also got the feeling like there was, especially in English, it was all like my favorite book about theory was, I forget the author's name, but the book was called Against Theory. Because everyone has a theory about these books, but then you realize it's like they're just reading their theories into these narratives that were written 100, 200, even 5 years ago, or even today. I mean, it's kind of, it became so theoretical, and it's like, but I still love to read and write, And John fortunately showed me that, there's a lot of authors who never went to school or were not even accepted in the academy, but who were still worth reading and whose books were around. And, he turned me on to a lot of classic literature and stuff that was not even on the, there's an important book. It's called How to Lie with Statistics. Teeny little book, came out in the 1950s. It's still like wonderful because it's got illustrations and but because it was talking about like how to avoid all the political and marketing bullshit that's going on in the world. And that was then. It's still a very valid book.
You get that book.
Yeah.
Immediately.
Yeah. So So that's why all of a sudden education became open. It was the whole world. It wasn't just school. All of a sudden education be me doing things, not me sitting there taking in stuff and memorizing, and then of course I realized like the things that I like to do, I play the piano, I do magic. I mean, and I was doing it even back then. I mean, that's always been part of me. It's like, I learn because I move. And that's part of me too. I need to touch and I'm a haptic learner perhaps, but that was never even mentioned. I mean, I never thought about it. I learned about learning styles and multiple intelligences later, and all these theories. And again, they're theories, that I keep feeling like they're good guesses, but but they're always used to justify making kids do what adults think they should do.
Yes.
Instead of what John is saying, the free exploration of the world is how a child learns. It's how we all learn. I mean, if you're gonna limit their explorations, you are controlling their learning. And sometimes that's appropriate, but usually it's appropriate when a student says, I would like to learn this. Well, here's how you play piano. Here's how you do a magic trick. That's when you get into the details. And if they don't have the discipline to stick with it, you're not getting, your job doesn't depend on it, like a teacher's does. So it's a shame. I think that the whole grading system is completely warped education, and judging in America, at least, judging teachers by their students' grades. It's just crazy, but that's how we do it,
But at least that's honest. I mean, as I see it, all of these standardized tests that we're unfortunately getting in Europe as well now, even in Scandinavia, they are not there to actually measure how the kids are performing, which you might be able to have a good, reason to see how is it actually going with these children. That's not the reason for these tests. It's to see how the teachers are doing, so that the teachers can compete with each other and how well they're doing. And they're just making the children's lives hell because they have to really study for these tests to see how good the teacher is performing instead of maybe making a good life for the children. I think the tests and the grading is.
I'm so sorry to hear that because, in Finland, I know that they completely de-emphasize grades.
Well, Finland is a different league.
Yeah,
I'm
right.
afraid.
I know. Yeah. But again, and this is what John kept saying. It's like, everyone said, this was, I think he even wrote this, when in the 1950s, everyone said that no one could run a mile in a minute. And then a guy named Roger Bannister did that. He ran a mile in under a minute, And John said, throughout my high school and college, that was just like a given because he was into sports. He would do weightlifting. In fact, I found like he kept track of how much he was lifting every day towards the end of his life there. He was really, really meticulous on record keeping. So anyway, I forgot, again, I'm wandering.
It's okay.
No,
So,
we're having a nice conversation. It was about Finland and
right. And John was always talking about like alternative assessments, other ways to do things, and it never gets accepted, but we have successful models, and so that's why to me, the most important thing about homeschooling, but unschooling in particular, is that it's empowering us, because modern society has gotten to the point. I mean, and this is no joke anymore, right? I mean, in the 80s, it was kind of a joke. We'd say, oh, they're looking at, the government or big business is looking at everything you do. See, but now it's really true, right? Who's watching us right now? Yeah. So, there's always been that, big brother sort of, thing associated with this, and as John points out, and many people besides John pointing this out, obedience to authority, and and using education as a social control tool. That's been a real eye opener for me, because I always thought education was for our benefit. It's like, no, it actually benefits a lot of other people and institutions besides us, and probably in bigger ways. So once I got that understanding, I realized, like, one of the things that John, I thought was crazy, but now I know is not, is if he saw a mom breastfeeding, he would say, good for you. If he saw someone making their own meal or something, he would, how did you do that? Where did you get that? Oh, you do that so well, and I forget, one of his friends told me, yeah, John like acts like it's the first time he's seen something all the time when he sees this stuff. And I asked him, why one time, particularly about the breast. It was, again, my mother probably used formula, I never saw breastfeeding until I started working at the Holt office, and then I was just like, John was like, anything that, makes us less dependent on the market or an institution is better for us, because society is just going to this whole way where, like, we're dependent on that. So to me, like, people, that's why I like this bigger vision of education, and this bigger vision of what homeschooling and unschooling is about. It's, I mean, we've reduced it, like, just as our religions have reduced themselves into political parties. And I've seen so many. I mean, like, the right-wing Christians have tried to take over homeschooling, and and everyone has their. The libertarians want you to unschool because it's they worship the free market. You should worship it too. You need to study this economist, or you need to be I forget, like, indigo children is another. Everyone has like their hobby horse of what works for education, and therefore what everybody else should be doing. And I realized, no, you should celebrate. You want to send your kid to school, fine. If that works for you, fine. And we all know that our kids at some point will take classes, and schoolers always do. It's it happens, So this idea that we're completely out of the system is just nonsense. But anybody who just even takes like one step away is suspect. And now that homeschooling is, I mean, it's only about 4% of the population now, but it was 2% before the pandemic. So and this is the American population. I don't know what it's like in Europe, but
I think Peter Gray gave us a different number.
Yeah,
Peter said it was in America up to maybe 9 at the moment.
Wow.
I don't know. I'm not in the States. I'm not looking at the numbers. It's just it looked better when he told
but even
maybe it was during the pandemic. I don't know.
Yeah, but even 9%, if you put that in perspective, it's a drop in the bucket compared to with 64 million children are in elementary school in America. I mean, it's still a lot. So we're still a minority, but that minority needs to be told that it's okay just to step out and form your own idea of what your family can do and how you can learn. And it's not an irrevocable decision. If you want to go back into the mainstream and go into school, fine. They'll welcome you. It happens all the time. But everyone's always worried, the kids are going to get left back. They're going to be, I've very, very rarely seen that. I've seen schools arbitrarily make a decision, say, oh, that child, was homeschooled for 3 years, so they can't get into 5th grade. They should really go to 4th. And I've seen people successfully argue, no, they could do 5th grade work, and let's see if they can, because it's true. Like if you move from California to Massachusetts, they don't, they have different curriculums and stuff, even in the public schools, different states. They just put you in the same grade, see how you do. Then they make a decision. So this idea that if you're going to homeschool your child, they're going to be outcast, ruining their life. I was so glad to get that over, get over that myself, because that naturally, that was my first reaction too back in 1981. But now it's like, why not? Especially as like we have this, people like Zuckerberg who just want us to wear a helmet all day and conduct our business in the metaverse. It's just like, wait a minute. How do we balance this? And that's one of those things that I've really found Ivan Illich's work to be very helpful, because people think like John Holt and Illich say, oh, don't go to school, don't do anything, just do what you want. And it's like, no, it's a balance. It's like, if I want to be a doctor, I'm going to have to go to some school, chiropractic or even Reiki, right? You got to go to some, take some classes and get certified. So yeah, that's going to happen. But at the same time, we're told that we need more and more school. To me, back in the 70s, there was a debate whether or not to go to college. And that debate was settled, because my parents told me a high school degree is not worth what it used to be. A high school degree is now what a college degree is worth. So you need a college. And I'm, so this hierarchy of value, education keeps depreciating it, and we have to keep adding more years of schooling. So now it's like, we put the lower age down to 5 or 4 now in a lot of states, and the upper age to 18, and that's, and then of course 4 years of college, now you're going to be 21, 22. So, we're putting more and more people in this box instead of like, well, how do we get them in the world? I mean, there's still going to be a need for teachers and classes and groups to do things, but we can organize them differently than we have. And that's where I think the big message gets lost with homeschooling and unschooling is it's like, it's not every man and woman for themselves. It's not like this completely individualized thing. I mean, I love how you were talking before we started this about how your friends are coming down to stay with you in Sicily. They're coming from Copenhagen, right? I mean, that's what it's like, when you're unschooling. You bring people in, and you welcome, you find people who want to welcome you into their lives,
But I think also, for me at least, one shift that we have to make more than whether or not we take classes or whether or not we study certain academics, we have to shift the whole idea that only academics count.
Yes.
As if education, so I could brag and talk about how many languages my kids speak and how many cultures they know about and how much Islamic art they can produce with their hands and whatever. And everybody would be very impressed. But if I talk about how good they are at cutting the nails of dogs and playing certain computer games or jumping into an ice cold pool or walking 20 kilometers in one day, that's not like, that doesn't count. And I think we have a job to do as unschoolers living outside this schooled lifestyle, to just question this idea that everything before the college degree, everything from birth to job is about how much academics can you learn. And this de-evaluates everything else. So it's not about how balanced are you, or will you make people happy when you enter a room, or can you find your way through, maybe, as you've just shared with us, really hard times. I mean, your 20s were not easy years. They were very, very formative years, and you had to take up a big challenge of helping a good friend through his last years. Can you manage that? There's so many other things, other challenges of this life than, I mean, it's easier to learn math when you're 56 than to learn to handle life. I mean, it's kind of too late if you're 56 and you don't even, know what to do with yourself when you get out of bed in the morning. And I think this whole evaluation system you shared, that you like to do magic tricks, people don't take that seriously, even though it's a skill. It takes a lot of work to do a good magic trick, and actually it can change the whole feeling of total situation. Everybody are a little more happy when you leave. And well, so I agree that we can do education in many different ways, but I also think that we have to consider not calling it education and coming to just calling it life. How do we want to live our life?
Yeah. John wrote a book called Instead of Education, Ways to Help People Do Things Better. Seems to me like a very simple concept, right?
But it will blow people's
do things better, right?
Not to just do things, because when you do things, you learn things. No one likes to do things that they are very good at and just keep doing same thing over and over and over. Maybe some do, because there are so many people. Probably there are a few people who like to do that. Most people don't. Most people like a challenge. And whenever there's a challenge, there's learning going on. So it's more about passion. It's more about doing things we really like to do and doing them well. Yeah. If we do that, we grow. And when we grow, we learn. So and learning.
Having the time. I mean, school eats up so much time. And then our work does too. It's a real issue. And that to me is what the balance thing is about. It's like balancing what I want to do with my family, with myself, and what society and the social expectations that others have, because I do have jobs, I work and engagements, with other people, and finding that balance is important, but it's so unbalanced right now. I mean, just while we're talking, I forgot to turn notifications off. So I'm having these little things up in the corner of my screen, right? These constant. Then, like every couple of weeks, I get notices from my healthcare company about things I should be doing or watching out for. It's like, leave me alone. There's so much noise. And then the scam calls and oh my God, don't get me going about the internet and Facebook, I mean, it's amazing how phony so much of this stuff is, and it's getting so much worse, So we really need to find authenticity by balancing, like, saying, no, I'm not going to use Facebook today, or I'm not, or at least for the next 3 hours, something like that. For me, it's like taking a break from the internet is a great thing. It really recharges my batteries.
I think I would like to ask you is, you have grown children and they have been homeschooled, unschooled as well. We are 10 years down the line with our oldest, who have never been to school. But if you are
not our oldest,
our oldest.
Ignore our oldest child.
No, I'm not ignoring our oldest child. She's a grown-up, so I don't see her as a child anymore. Our second child has never been to school. A second home-based child right now. But I talked with Cecilia earlier this day about, hey, we were going to talk with you, and she said, oh, I remember back when we started this, and when I was like, that could be interesting to start to homeschool or unschool. But I mean, if you have a baby on the lap, there's so much stuff going on in your life. You don't maybe have the time to read all the books out there. So how to start? What are you? Do you have any advice for people who are starting down the road?
Well, I think that one of the best things you could do is to actually meet people in person. I think it could be a real mistake going on to Facebook or a website first. I mean, that's what we do now. But I've talked to more than one person who said, "Oh, I went to such and such a group, and they were just so high-handed and dismissive of my concerns, and and so." I mean, people, I appreciate it, because I spent a lot of time in the 80s talking to my parents, my mother-in-law, so trying about like the value of homeschooling and unschooling in particular. And so, but I appreciate that. Like I said, or at the top of this, like people are still asking about socialization and if they can get into college, even though there's books and research, and again, you can find that on the internet if you want. But, the internet has become so poisoned, it's really, you really need a good Sherpa to find things that are worth paying attention to.
So would you recommend go look for someone who homeschool or unschool and meet them in person rather
Absolutely.
than picking up a book?
Yeah, and try to meet their, if you can, and try to meet their children. I think that's the thing is like, to me, meeting the children of these families, we had open houses. John, the first Wednesday or the last Wednesday of a month, John would have an open house. And people would come down to the office to talk with John, and what got me convinced that homeschooling worked was my conversations with the kids. Because none of them were, sure, there were a few that were shy and wouldn't talk to me, but by and large, they were not. They were used to talking to strangers, with their parents nearby. Yeah. And there were, very, it was very comfortable and interesting to talk to them. It wasn't just like, oh, how's school? They would talk about like, oh, the thing that we're building this, I'm on the sports team, I'm doing gymnastics. It wasn't just like the grind, the usual discussion you have with a fifth grader, say, coming out of school, that kind of blew me away. It's like, they're not talking about cramming for tests and, how they hate this book and hate this teacher and blah, blah, blah. Instead, it was like, oh yeah, I'm doing this, I'm doing that, I help my mom and dad do X, Y, and Z, all of a sudden it's like, wow. It's like we were saying earlier, education is not, schooling is not the same as education.
Exactly.
We've completely, screwed the term education, because we forget its origin. I talk about this in a talk I gave on YouTube about the 40th anniversary edition of Teach Your Own. But, and I've mentioned this more than once, but real quickly, Ivan Illich pointed out, the Latin word for root for education is the word educare. Right? And that means to draw forth. And what it specifically means is to draw forth mother's milk. It's nurturing. It's referring to the act of breastfeeding, of nurturing. And then Illich pointed out that, that's why if you look at some medieval monasteries or earlier, the abbots are shown having breasts because they're dispensing the milk of knowledge. The milk of kindness and so on, so but we've taken the idea to draw forth the opposite. It's not the baby pulling, it's the adult doing the pushing. And so if we would only switch that around, because that's what unschooling is about, right? Oh, you want to learn the piano? Let's try it. Oh, you don't like the piano? Okay, try some drums, whatever. No music, fine. But in school, it's like, no, you got to keep playing that piano till the end of the semester, and then we'll make a decision. It's like, come on,
It's about voluntary education. It's about who decides.
Yeah, who decides? Yeah.
Not about whether you take a class or not. It's about who decides, do you take that class? And
right.
I think also
why do I want to do that?
We took all initiative out of the children because we decide, we the adults, and also you said we started this conversation about the individual versus the institution, and with our governments we give them the power to, in an institutionalized way, to decide for everyone what they are going to do with 10 years of their life, even more sometimes places. Yeah. And so there is no personal freedom for the children. There's no voluntary education. It's all being decided by someone else. Yeah. And if you flip that around and say, let's do that from you're 32 and 15 years onwards, someone else decides what you're going to do. No one. It would be, it would be riot.
It'd be riots.
But as we do it to the children, we think that we we've made this fantasy world where we have the right to do that, and we believe it's really weird that it's a good thing.
Right. Yeah.
Which is obviously not. To me,
right.
to me,
think about it. You know, it's time. You know, it's our time. And having seen like the untimely death of dogs and family members and stuff, time is really, really important. You know, and what do we do to kids? Well, I don't know about you two, but I could say, I had my years of Spanish. I can't speak Spanish. I had my years of higher math. I could do some algebra, but that's about it. You know, but I passed those courses. You know, I can't remember half of the world history I studied. You know, but I remember the magic. I remember the music. I remember some of the books I've read and some papers that I've written. But you know,
I was very
so much of the time is to waste. I'm sorry, it's to waste people's time. It seems
exactly. Yeah,
and then get paid for it and saying, "Oh, here's an A, you're wonderful," but you don't even remember it. You know. No,
I was a very good student. I had a lot of the equivalent of A's in my time, and I know when I scroll back my years of my childhood, what I learned in my own time.
Exactly.
I learned to read before I started in school. My mother was a Danish teacher, and so she had a whole library of literature, and I sat under the table or in the chair at the nights because I couldn't sleep and read all her books. I studied French in France, not in school. I learned English in a summer vacation with my sister because we took it as a challenge.
Yeah.
Just let's learn to speak English. And so we did. And I had a few inspiring teachers for short times of my years in school where I remember I actually learned something while being in the school setting.
Right.
Otherwise, I learned because I was cheating. I was not paying attention to what was going on in the school because I had a book under the table reading something that actually interested me.
Right. Not unheard of.
But I got all these A's and, you know, they were so impressed, but it was just a waste of time. It really was.
Is a way, yeah. And, you know, because, you know, if someone wants to learn something, like now I want to learn Spanish, you know, so I'm doing Duolingo on my own, you know, and it's like, no one's forcing me, you know, and I have a reason. You know, I'd like to perform for magic for inner city children. You know, most of them speak Spanish. I was like, you know, you know, something I could do with my life. So, why not?
Spanish is fun. I learned Spanish a few years ago. It's a fun language.
Yeah. You know, but again, like I had mandatory Spanish. I don't remember any of it, and I passed. Same thing with Latin. I had to take Latin when I was in high school, right? Although I appreciate it. I mean, my brother Philip was a Latin major in college. So, you know, I appreciate the Latin language. That doesn't mean I have to speak it and study it. You know, I appreciate German and Danish, but they're not on my list to learn.
I'm happy there are doctors around, but I'm not a doctor. We don't have to all be able to do everything.
Yeah. Right. But we think, at least in the States, that everyone has to go to college in order to be somebody. Otherwise, you know, and the thing is,
it's so weird, you know, why are we not somebody just, you know,
right?
Well, we are.
And the thing is, when I revised Teach Your Own in 2021, so this is going back to almost 2 years now, I found that the Federal Reserve Bank of New York noted that 43% of college graduates are doing work that does not require a college degree.
Yes.
43%. Why, you know, why go through that expense and trouble and mental anguish, you know, and you're going to wind up like I did, you know, the master's degree, working in a bookstore, running a cash register and stocking books.
Well, that would be because you want your college degree. If you're having fun,
and you should.
Then I think you should do it.
Yes, absolutely.
The problem is the motivation, and the problem is who decides.
Yes.
The person really wants to go to college because that's where all the fun is, and they want to read all the books, and that's just so very interesting. Right. Go ahead, knock yourself out. I had 10 wonderful years at university. I loved it. It was amazing. because there was actually professors around who knew what they were talking about. And I was reading real books in loads of languages, and it was very, very interesting. I had a lot of fun. I never used my education ever to get a job, but I had a lot of fun and found it very interesting. And I think everyone should go do it. I would like another university degree just for fun. But to do it to be someone, or to do it because someone else think you have to, or that's a waste of time. It really is.
But Pat, I'm actually glad you ended up with a college degree that made you stand in a bookstore.
I know, the way life goes, right?
Yeah, because that bookstore have led many people to help getting to know unschooling. And I'm looking a little at the time. We try to keep our podcast to around an hour, but we have so much more to talk about.
Just one thing.
Please go ahead.
One thing I want to add, because Cecilia, something you said just triggered it. It's like, if you want to go to college to study like oceanography or marine biology, definitely. But let's not think that that's the only way to study those topics. So because I'll never forget this. There's I had it somewhere here. Here it is. This is the 30th anniversary edition of the Teenage Liberation Handbook. Grace Llewellyn wrote this in 1991, and she used a lot of material from Growing Without Schooling. It's still in here, and this is a great book. I just love this book. But one of the things that, and I don't think this is in the book, but she said this in a talk that when the first edition came out, she came to Boston and she gave a wonderful talk, and I really remember this. She said she read in Growing Without Schooling that a daughter asked her dad, "I want to become a marine biologist." I want to work with the ocean and sea animals. And so he said, "Oh, well, then you're going to have to become a marine biologist." And, that's that education thinking going, right?
Yes, it is.
And Mark Grace said, "Well, what about like all the other ways that you could study, you could study whale songs. If you're into music, you could, study the musicality. If you're an artist, you could be drawing the animals. You could be drawing the seascapes. There are so many different ways of approaching marine biology. It just doesn't have to be from an academic point of view. You can work for the Cousteau Society. You don't need a college degree to do that. But what all these things do is they may lead you to a college degree, because that may be the next step, But we put all these obstacles in front of people to do jobs, that are based on very arbitrary credentials. To me, the only fair way that this would ever work out, in terms of like, I'm qualified to do a job, is that you actually have a test at the job, like 6 weeks where you try to sell cars, and then they hire or fire you up to, or if you're a scientist or something, you've got to work on a project with certain people for 3 times or 3 weeks or something, and see how you gel and so on. Instead, we just use college degrees as proxies. Oh, you got a college degree in science? Great, you'll make a great scientist. Well.
Maybe not. But that was what I was trying to say, that my 10 years at university, I enjoyed the studying in and of itself.
Yeah.
Because I liked it. And I knew when I started, I want to be here because I want to read these books, not because I want to do what I can do afterwards with the degree.
Right. It's not a means to an end.
So if you want to study marine biology because you're really interested in studying marine biology, not working with the ocean, then go study marine biology. I think I really recommend, I'm not against education. I think it was wonderful, and I would like another university degree. I think it was amazing. I just think we have to do it because we like doing it, because that's what lights the fire in the morning. We do it as means to an end that's kind of wobbly. We don't really even know why we're doing it, or what are we going to do with it afterwards. Then it's a lot of time and money to spend.
That's right.
For something we might use.
Yeah, I mean, and there's a lot about like the way we structured university life that's worthwhile and that people want. I don't know if this is a trend in Europe, but in America, they're putting a lot of retirement, not a lot, but there are retirement communities being built near colleges or built by the colleges, so that they could take advantage of like these lectures and social gatherings about intellectual topics and whatnot. As people do. I mean, if we don't turn them off to education, it's a lifelong thing, but we spend so much time turning it into a do as I say, sit down, shut up, and do as I say sort of practice.
I don't know how it's going with your.
And we're using the first 10 years to turn people off before they are free to enjoy the education at the university.
Well, as Illich wrote back in the 70s, he said, school is set up to pre-alienate children for office work. So they'll be used to it.
So they're ready, yeah. Okay, maybe we ended on that laugh.
Yeah, but we should definitely talk again, Pat, where we talk on unschooling. It was wonderful to hear your road onto the where you ended up with unschooling. For people who want to know more about growing without schooling and your own work, where should they go? Where will they find your work?
On my website, www.johnholtgws.com. GWS is the initials for the magazine, Growing Without Schooling, that John started and that I continued after he passed away. He published it from 77 to 85, and I published it from mid-85 to 2001. So we did almost a little more than 2 times as many issues as John did. So there's, to me, that's another thing. Like John died, but the work grew and carried on. So as another thing, I said, this is important beyond just, this idea of, selling a book.
It's still one of the first persons people talk about. Once you mention, I might want to homeschool, read John Holt.
Yeah.
But now I would say to them, go meet real people.
Yeah, go meet real people.
That's my, I mean, if you can't, if there's no real people in your, then reading John, but, gosh, I know Teen Lib is a good book. There's a lot of good books. I've only read part of it, but gosh, I can't think of the title right now, but Gina Riley has a book about the joy of unschooling, and she just interviews families, talk about what makes unschooling a happy event for them. And so I'm looking forward to reading that.
But that could be one of the topics for our next talk, all the great books on the subject out there, so people know what to look for. But now we should end. It was wonderful.
Yes.
Again.
Thanks so much. It's always a pleasure speaking with you. And enjoy Sicily. I've never been there. I've been to Rome twice, but never been to Sicily.
Too late.
Yeah. Hopefully I'll make it.
I would wait a month or two. It's quite cold in Sicily at the moment, actually.
Yeah, I know. It's pretty cold here.
I would believe April would be a good time to go.
But we are learning the culture in deep, because the place we have rented, there's a pizza oven, so we are.
Hey, there you go.
We are learning it the good way.
Sicilian pizza. No.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Take care. Good seeing you.
Bye.
All right. Bye.
Thank you for listening. We hope you enjoyed today's episode, and if you liked it, then please share it with all your friends and family. We would also love it if you gave our podcast a review. Thanks. And if you want to support our podcast and work, then you can find us on patreon.com/theconradfamily. We will continue to travel full time, and if you want to tag along, then please follow us on Facebook and Instagram @theconradfamily. And you can also read more than 100 blog posts on our website, theconrad.family. Until next time, make a wonderful day. Thank you.